Just a couple more minutes, a few more seconds, really. All right, well, I'm going to get started. Again, this is David DeWitt, Trade Relations Manager with the Oregon Wine Board, and we thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. This is the 5th installment of our Oregon Wine Month educational webinar. We're really excited to talk today about the Umpqua Valley. We have a really great panel assembled for you, so we're extremely excited to educate and inform everybody of this fantastic region here in Oregon. Everybody should know that their devices are muted. We will be monitoring the question feature as well as the chat. The chat seems to be more popular. We will answer questions the best we can as they pop up. The webinar itself is being recorded. We will make it available afterwards. There's the link where you can go to get that. And then some of the materials that we're covering can also be found on our resource studio. However, if you would like a copy of the deck for some of the slides, we can furbish that to you as well. And we'll have our contact information towards the end. As I mentioned, it is Oregon Wine Month. May is officially here, and we're excited to promote the wines from all over the state. In a second here, I'm going to put in a link to our Oregon Wine Month toolkit. So if there is any needs for last minute assets, digital assets or information, it's a great resource to tap into to help promote. There's printed materials that you can generate. There's digital assets for e-commerce and social media and what have you. And thanks everybody who is supporting, and thanks everybody for joining us. I am going to turn it over to our Director of Education, Bree Stock. She is the Master of Ceremonies, and she's been doing a great job. In April, we've been moving through these webinars, and now here we are in May, and excited to talk about the Umpqua. So Bree, please take it away.
Thanks, David. Happy to be back for another Oregon Wine Month webinar. And this time I have a fantastic panel with me, which I always love because I get to learn and hear as many stories as you all do. So it's always exciting for me to have some great panelists here. We have with us today Dyson Demara of Hillcrest and many other wineries and wine brands that Dyson's involved in, including Paul O'Brien Winery, where we also have Scott Kelley, head winemaker for Paul O'Brien, and also Greg Jones, Dr. Greg Jones, who is from Abacela Winery and also a climatologist, world-renowned, and who's going to really give you the lowdown on the climate in the Umpqua Valley. I am not going to do very much talking at all today. I'm just going to push all of your questions. So please put all of your questions in the chat or in Q&A. We'll be watching for them. And I'm going to put them all in front of our 3 panelists today to answer all of your questions. So don't hold back. I would love to welcome Dyson to give us the rundown on the Umpqua Valley here and really give us a sense of where we are on the West Coast and about the valley itself. And Dyson, just let me know when you want me to push forward to the next slide as well. And you're on mute.
Many prefer it that way. No, thank you for a nice introduction, and thank you for all those that are participating and letting us tell our story a little bit. And, the magic of what we call the mighty Umpqua Valley, which is a very special place, but is not very well known. And so I've been asked to touch a little bit on just kind of an overview on Umpqua Valley, and I'm going to start at about 30,000 foot elevation to kind of come down. I want to put it in context of what is on the West Coast and how we fit into that, and then talk a little bit about the history, which is a very interesting history that's not very well known, and then talk a little bit about soils. That'll cross a little bit into kind of the climate, as those two are related, but Greg's really going to kick that off. And then towards the end, we'll talk a little bit about the future and varietals and that, and kind of what we find are most exciting. So you know, when we travel out in the marketplace and we try to paint a picture of what Umpqua Valley is for many of our customers that have actually never been there, we go out into Texas or the East Coast and that, I always try to share something that they're familiar with and kind of relate it to that. And I think the area that we share the most in common with is actually the Russian River of California. If you were to, you know, I worked for Mondavi for many years, as did Scott, who's on this. And many of the old timers and people we worked with will come up and they'll get out of their cars and they'll look at it and say, oh my God, this looks like Russian River, or even parts of Mendocino. And so we tend to compartmentalize and say, oh, Oregon is this and California is this, but really those are just political boundaries. And so if you were to take the Russian River and basically flip it up over on the north side of the California-Oregon border, the soil types that we have, the landscape to a great extent, a lot of the climate is actually shared, and we're actually quite different because of that from Willamette Valley. So most people are familiar with, you know, if you look at the mountains, kind of the geography of the West Coast. We have the coastal mountains, which run pretty much north to south because you have the Pacific plate that's on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean tucking under the North American plate. And as that shaves off, it builds these coastal ranges that we have a very cold body of water off of our coast, of course. And that tends to be blocked by those coastal mountain ranges. But every once in a while, you'll find a place that it infiltrates. And much like Russian River, we have a river called the Umpqua River where that infiltrates, much like Salinas Valley or Monterey, it comes from the north to the south. So we would say Russian River is coolest in the west side near Monterito, Guerneville, and that. And then as you get towards the east, you get into Oak Savannah and this. And you know, in terms of the landscape, it's that rolling kind of hills, and we see it with and we'll get into some pictures that show this a little bit. But if we look at the Umpqua Valley appellation, which is the northernmost highlighted section here, if you see where Elkton is, you'll see the rivers that's marked in the blue, and that's actually the inlet where the cold air comes in. And much like you get into Napa Valley, where the north end of that is closed off by Calistoga, and on a warm day it heats up and it begins to draw that cool air that's off the south end of the valley that's sitting on top of the bay, and this gives you that incredible range of temperatures. We have the same thing, which is pretty amazing. It's a pretty amazing range of temperatures and climate. So as a general rule, you can say from the farther north you go, the cooler it is, and then as you move to the south, the warmer it is. To the north of us, what really separates us from the Willamette Valley is it rarely do you see it, but you'll see sometimes a mountain range that will go east to west that will block things. So when people think of Oregon and they think of the Willamette Valley, that's that same kind of coastal influence with things like the Van Duzer Gap and Van Duzer Corridor and that. But between Eugene and the very north end of our appellation, as is shown here, there's a mountain range called the Calapuyas, which goes north to south, which blocks that influence. So we're kind of a locked-in little valley that's extreme maritime conditions and that. But we have this very nice, gentle kind of cooling influence. As for soils, and I can probably use this map as well, there's really two primary parent sources for soil. And actually, let me say that for a little bit. Let me get a little bit into history. If we can move down into the history slide, please. Yeah, that gives you an idea of the topography. Yeah.
Old vines, yeah.
Old vine. So this will get a little bit into the history. This is a 1961 planting, which was the first planting of Chardonnay post-Prohibition in Oregon. And this happens to be on a property that my wife and I are current proprietors of, which is Hillcrest Vineyard, which was started by Richard Summers, the pioneer of modern Oregon wine, the first to plant Pinot Noir, bottle Pinot Noir, amongst other things. So he
didn't just bring Pinot Noir, did he?
No, yeah, exactly. He brought old man Louis Martini Sr. had 35 varieties that he pulled from down at Stanley Ranch, which is now, I think, Starmont, down in that area, kind of Highway 12, 121 and 29 as you get into Napa Valley. But he brought those varieties up in 59 as cuttings with the idea that he was one of the first graduates of Davis, with the idea that he would plant Pinot Noir and Riesling and then to see what else would do well. And amongst those other varieties were things like Barbera, Malbec, many of the varieties like Tokai that were very popular at their time, Gamay, and that were planted, brought in as cuttings and then planted in 61. But there's also a historical perspective of pre-Prohibition that Napa has a tie to, Umpqua Valley has a tie to Napa Valley, that the first Coopers that worked at Beringer when they opened in 1861, which is interesting because I looked at this and it's 1961, 100 years before. I've never thought of this before. The Beringer brothers brought over two families, the von Pessels and the Dorner family, to build cask for them. And if you go to the Beringer founders room, there's a picture up there of some of the Germans building casks. Those are actually people that later moved in the late 1800s to Umpqua Valley. And the one family, the Dorner family, was the first family to actually commercially produce wine that we're aware of in Umpqua Valley. And at one time they were making 5,000 gallons of wine and distilling in that, and were partners. They were barrel makers and that, but they planted, which was interesting, Zinfandel. They did a field blend, Zinfandel, Kleinberger, and Sauvignon Vert, or what's known as Sauvignese. And those were all blended together to make a red wine that they were making 5,000 gallons of by the early 1900s and selling that in this area. So, I mean, 5,000 gallons with the population that we had back then must have been something pretty amazing. Followed by Richard Summers. So Prohibition shut that down. The first winery opened post-Prohibition, and first vineyards planted were by Richard Summers, once again in 61 at Hillcrest. We had about 6 or 7 wineries here prior to that. And then I think the next benchmark is definitely Greg's parents coming to the Umpqua Valley to find a place for Tempranillo, which is a variety that they hold close to their heart. And after a lot of research looking, different parts of America, this was considered to be kind of the choice place. And I'd have to say we are the anchor in America for high quality Tempranillo, without a doubt. It's one of the varieties that is a benchmark that you see many of the wineries produce, and it's something you can go into the different taste rooms and kind of see. And Tempranillo is a variety, of course, it has a long history in California, but not necessarily for fine wine, but it's a variety that's super interesting in cooler areas, as we know from the popularity and the kind of the quality we see and the recognition now out of Spain and in the American market. Following that, and I think this speaks to our area, is that there's tremendous amount of exploration. We oftentimes will have interns that come from Napa Valley, maybe they're from Spain or Italy, and they'll come up here on some time off when they go to work in Napa Valley, and they'll question why Napa Valley people aren't growing these varieties, other Spanish varieties, Italian, French, and that. And Scott knows this better than anyone. He worked for Mondavi at a property, La Familia di Robert Mondavi, that focused on Italian reds, and there were some brilliant wines such as Sangiovese made in the Stagsley region of Napa Valley by Scott. But the problem is economically you just can't do that. And so one of the beautiful things about being here in an area, it's really like if you could go into Russian River today in Sonoma County and there's no vineyards, but we have what we know today, and you can go in and plant it, and it's reasonably priced. So we have a palette of flavors that we've played with, but there's just so far to go. It's not, I think all of Oregon's planted 80 varieties out of the somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 grape varieties people talk about there being. And it's endless. So we see things like Brunner Veltliner that have been planted. We think we can talk some more about some of the Italian varietals. We see Sangiovese, Bacco Noir, Terroir de Go. You go on and on and on. And so it's very much, it's not only an area of very high quality, but it's an area of exploration. So next slide, please.
That's just the Umpqua map.
Umpqua map. So here we see the parent sources again, the coastal range, which once again is that's the North American plate being kind of hit by the Pacific plate ducking underneath that. I mentioned that, if you drop somebody off here kind of blindfolded, oftentimes they would think that they, were in the Russian River. So that coastal mountain range there, that is mostly sedimentary soils. You see, like Russian River's famous for Gold Ridge sandy loam. Where I'm sitting right here is a sandy loam that's red in color. It's what we call Iverson. That's a super interesting soil. You have a very large ridge, about 2,600 feet, that falls off into this kind of fingers in the valley that float down into the very valley towards the river and that. And you'll see conifers, and it's that same kind of cool, moist coastal forest that you see in the north coast of California. And then you get about 3 or 4 miles east, kind of halfway between where you see Highway 5 is, I-5 there, and the boundary on the west side of the Umpqua wine growing area. In many areas, you start moving into oak savanna. And oak savanna is super interesting because that's where you see, you know, a Hillsborough. And you start seeing warmer climate grapes, you start seeing Zinfandel, you start seeing some Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, like Russian River, that's kind of the exception and not the rule. There are pockets there. So, you know, with tomatoes, they have early season, mid-season, late season varieties. The same thing is true of grapes. We categorize them the same way, where Russian River can do early season, mid-season, and some late season, or the same way. So it tends to be the same kind of growing conditions. To me, one of the greatest differences, though, is there's over 150 different series of soils. So Napa Valley is very unusual, being there 32. So 150 different soil types. It's the most complex matrix of soils of any wine region I know in the world. And I've been fortunate enough to travel and I read a lot. Maybe there's something out there, but I mean, it is truly, truly amazing. And on top of it, much like Northern Italy, so there are some wine regions of the world, they tend to be the better regions for me, that there's very little flatland. And that's one of the reasons I think Umpqua Valley is not as well known as the big producers, like areas like Walla Walla that you get into and you have large tracts of land, all the sun, all the water you can have. We're more like Piemonte, that there's no flatland. It's over 75% mountains and hills. And so it's very challenging to figure out what in your little pocket up on the eastern exposure, top of the hill, bottom of the hill, southern exposure, northern exposure, what you grow. But the potential for quality is fantastic, but it comes much more slowly because each and every grower has to kind of discover for themselves their property. And you know, as we've seen from the Europeans that send their family members to the west coast of the United States, or really the New World, that exploration is everything. To be in an area that's defined legally and restrained really is not interesting for us. You know, I mean, maybe the great wine of 100 years from now of Umpqua Valley hasn't been planted yet. You know, there's so many beautiful, interesting varieties that are opening up. So anyway, next slide, I guess. So we talked a little bit about the coastal, the Cascades, and that. Greg's going to get much more into climate, which is very, very fascinating. We've talked about the dirt. I'm a dirt guy, and that's the most fascinating thing. When I came up here, the only people who really knew much about that were the forestry folks, because they tried to figure out, they say Los Angeles was built out of Douglas County, where Umpqua Valley is, and those people knew where Doug fir would grow the fastest. But we have everything from the sandy loams that I talked about. We have vineyards that have like cobblestone to them from massive water blowouts and that. And so we have this matrix of soils. When you overlay it with what Greg's going to talk about, the climate is truly a super special area that, you know, we talk about it, but also when you go to taste the wines reinforce that. There's I always talk about point of sale and point of consumption. When we put wines in people's mouths, they see this, and anyway, it's a unique place. There's a fingerprint of the gardens that are here, and that's kind of where we are as exploring it. So it's kind of like the Northern Willamette 1980, where, you know, people said over on this road somebody's pulling out a vineyard or an orchard, filbert orchard, and planting this, and you go down here at the county line and road and somebody's planting this. We're still the same way. We have a little few appellations that are kind of recognized now, or sub-appellations, but it's really kind of the Wild West in an incredible way, with our modern understanding that leads for a very bright future. So
yeah, it's pretty exciting about how many varieties that we have access to now, and that ability to be able to, you know, have abundant rainfall, you know, warm growing season that's capable of ripening so many different varieties depending on the aspect and of slope and the climate that comes through here as well. And I love this map, Greg, that you've given us here, to give a bit of an idea of just the elevation changes, and just how distinctive that, you know, these river systems are. But then, you know, to Dyson's point, just how many valleys and mountains and, you know, carved little valleys there are, because of all of that ancient, you know, geological change, but then also all of the rivers that have moved through here as well.
So is it my turn?
Yeah, do you want to tell us a little bit more about the climate?
Well, I just want to kind of back up some of the things Dyson was saying, and also Bree was just mentioning. I've been very fortunate to have both been part of a family growing grapes in the Umpqua Valley. but also doing research in the region and being able to drive the back roads of Southern Oregon and the Umpqua Valley have been just an absolute treat. I think there's just some spectacular landscapes and places to visit, and all of these little valley extensions have potential, I think, for growing grapes. And there's just so many potential opportunities out there. I just think that this shows quite a bit of that nature of that landscape from the north to the south throughout the Umpqua Valley. Go ahead to the next slide, please. When we talk about the climate of this area, I have to come back to, oh, Bree, I just noticed we have a misspelled name down there.
Oh, do we?
Abacela is spelled as you would pronounce it, Abacela.
Abacela.
So anyway, hopefully everybody can laugh with me on that one. So I just want to touch base. This is my family's vineyard. I'm looking out the window at this property right now. And I can tell you that back in the early 90s, when my father and stepmother wanted to grow Tempranillo in Oregon, they looked for a place that would allow them to do that, where the land was still at a reasonable price, the infrastructure, the community, everything behind it was here. And the bigger piece of all of this was the climate for my father and my stepmother. And I helped him go through a lot of this process in terms of what we were trying to better understand about where grapes grew in the world and what kind of climate influences there were producing the situation by which we could grow quality fruit and therefore make quality wines. Next slide.
Oops. There we go.
So I've just got some information here. I want to expound upon each one of these points because, as Dyson said, we have this wide diversity of landscapes, which in turn produces wide diversity in climate. And all of that is driven by the geology, of course. The Umpqua Valley has mountains to our west, like most West Coast regions do, but ours are fairly unique in that they protect us a little bit, but they also allow enough rainfall in throughout the year. So we have this framework by which we have a wide array of terroirs. They're becoming more and more recognized over time. And I think that they will continue as more and more people find the nature of the Umpqua Valley as a wine growing region. The second bullet in here, I think, is really important. A growing season for wine grapes needs to be roughly 6.5 to 7 months long. If it's too long, then the fruit doesn't know when to ripen appropriately. If it's too short, the fruit can't ripen appropriately. So what we end up with is places, closer to the equator that tend to have really long growing seasons, which are really hard to manage growth and ripening, or places further toward the polar regions in which it's sometimes often hard just to even ripen the fruit. So we have this growing season that really fits the ideal biology of the vine to bring it toward ripening right at the time when we're starting to cool down at the end of the season. So we typically have a 6 to 7 month growing season, a short spring, a fairly warm to hot and dry summer, and then the autumn is fairly short as well. It comes on us pretty quickly, and we transition from there into winter. We do have sufficient annual precipitation. We're not as dry as some places to our south or further inland. We have a fairly reasonable annual precipitation, but low growing season rainfall, roughly 10 to 20% of annual, and most of it comes early in the year and very, very late in the year. And then the last piece of that is that we have very low ripening period rainfall, meaning the last 30 or so days before ripening, we have a tendency to be much lower rainfall than some places to our north and even to the south. Our growing season temperatures and heat accumulation or growing degree days typically range from relatively cool to intermediate to somewhat warm conditions. So we have a range of ripening climates, so to speak, based upon our landscapes and geology that they produce. We also, if you move into the ripening period, as I said, we have these nice cool nights here, but really what we have are these diurnal temperature ranges, which are really ideal for telling the vine to ripen the fruit and produce some of the most delicate, wonderful aromas and flavors that you'll find anywhere. I've done a lot of research in the climate space in vineyards worldwide, and there really are not places in the world that I can find that have greater day-night temperature differences during ripening than the Umpqua Valley in Southern Oregon. It's really pretty dramatic, and I think this is what allows us to ripen our fruit in the right kind of framework to really allow it to express itself the way it's supposed to. Next
So
slide,
Greg,
please.
what would the average, temperature be during the day, and then what would it drop down to at night?
So for us in September and October, we're typically looking at maybe a maximum of 80 degrees during the day and 50 degrees at night. So a 50-degree diurnal temperature range during that part of the year, getting toward the end of September, is really quite large for most wine regions throughout the world. If I just give everybody an example, if you go to Bordeaux rarely gets into maybe 75 or so during that period of time, but the nighttime temperatures don't drop as low. They stay elevated in the 60s most of the time. So they don't have that nighttime coolness that really helps develop freshness and retain acidity within the fruit.
And is that mostly being moderated by the ocean influence that's sort of getting pulled in as the valley heats up, and then in the afternoon it's pulling in that cool ocean influence?
Yeah, I think there's multiple different things, of course, that are going on. Number one, elevation, distance to the coast, and the type of ocean that we have offshore, which is cool enough to keep those wind patterns and flow at a temperature that really is helpful. If we had a little bit warmer ocean, we would probably elevate quite a bit in temperature overall. So, going back to this idea of our landscapes producing a lot of variation and framework behind it, I think we have a very equitable climate from all of this framework. Can we go to the next slide?
Yeah. Greg, there's a question about when set happens. Is it in mid-June?
Yeah, so I didn't include any of this data here, but we typically in the Umpqua Valley go through bud break somewhere between the 5th and 15th of April. We go through flowering and then fruit set sometime between the 5th of June to about the 15th of June. And then veraison, when color change and sugar development starts happening, is sometime in early August to mid-August. And then ripening really is quite variable depending on the variety and the location, but we can go anywhere from early September to middle of October, depending on many factors. But going back to this idea of an equitable climate, we have this really, I think, a very ideal place in terms of the climate itself. But the other piece of it is we have very low climate risk. And I think this is really important. It was important for my family when they were first coming here to look at this area. We have very low winter freeze risk. We just do not get as cold as other places a little further inland, a little further north do. So we just don't have that winter freeze risk. We do have low spring frost risk. Typically, we get through without much risk there at all. This year we had a little cold spell, and so we're all looking at that, but most of the time, very, very low frost risk. We also have low fall frost risk. And the reason that this is important is once you harvest the fruit, you do not want your vines going into a real cold period too quickly, because that can actually damage them going into the next growing season. So we have this very, very low fall frost risk as well. The other component is, yes, we're warm during the summer, but our heat stress numbers are lower typically than many other places, especially to our south. So we have enough heat to ripen varieties, but overall we don't have as much heat stress. And this produces, as I said, what I think are nearly ideal ripening climates for a wide range of varieties that we work with here. Next slide.
Greg, sorry.
Sorry.
When you say heat stress, are you talking about the need for the plant to shut down or close its stomata and stop that ripening or photosynthesis process?
Yeah, heat stress can be manifested in quite a few different ways. Of course, low heat stress when the vines are water stressed can be a problem too. But most of the time when we talk about heat stress, we're talking about what are the upper temperatures that cause the vine to more or less shut down and not stop producing carbohydrates and photosynthetic activity. And so the issue there is that every variety has a slight difference in terms of those numbers. For some varieties, it could be as high as 100, 105 degrees, and others it could be 95 degrees. And so when you look at the numbers of the number of days above 95 or 100 or 105, the Umpqua Valley tends to have a lower heat stress number overall during the growing season.
And that results in those very precise aromas and bright fruit flavors. And
well, I think what it does is it allows us to ripen the fruit without being damaged in terms of the overall heat stress. Heat stress can actually cause harvest to be later than it would be otherwise. So without that heat stress, we're able to ripen the fruit into that cooler part of the ripening period.
Great.
So go ahead to the next slide. I think we got another lovely picture of the region. Here we are looking out at one of the large vineyards in the Garden Valley area. Again, a lot of different landscapes that we can grow grapes here within the region. Next slide, please. Everybody's heard a little bit of this, I think the term, the sense of place. Somebody, I think Matt Kramer once wrote about it being somewhereness, if that's a word. Not sure it is. But I really believe that this is important for this region. Our latitude fixes the photo period, which creates a growing season that's not too long and not too short. It is all driven by the fact that we have this varied geology and soil that produces all the frameworks by which we plant today, but it also produces this climate that I think is ideal for quite a few of the varieties. I've just given a short list of ones here that ripen right at the climatic edge in a growing season that's just right for them. We get varietal character, we get natural acidity being retained in the vines, we get nearly ideal Brix levels, sugar levels for the varieties we grow. And I think this allows us to make the best wine from the varieties that we grow here, virtually compared to any place in America. So that's kind of my take on the climate component of this. Bree, do you have anything else you want to add to that?
No, I was just thinking that I was just thinking quite broadly about the, wine growing regions in the US and thinking about the number of grape varieties that you find in the valley, and how all of them are great expressions of the varietal, but also of that moderate Umpqua climate as well. You have ripeness without high alcohol, without excessively high alcohols or stewed fruit flavors, and very good varietal typicity. And so I was just thinking about, I can't think of another area that has just so many grape varieties planted, another wine region that can do so many varieties so well.
And just to add to that, I'm not even sure we know the potential range of varieties we could do. We have this statement that we have over 40, and that's proven. But I think we could actually do quite a bit more, and only time will tell. And the new people who come in and find this region to plant grapes and will likely plant new varieties that we'll learn more about.
Yeah, we just have so much more access now to, plant material as well that we haven't had in the past. And so when you get a region that's so full of curious winemakers and grape growers, it's such a fun place to visit and to taste through, because you can literally, taste the world in a single valley. Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Greg, there's one question here about what changes in climate are you seeing and what changes to the grapes are expected in the future?
Well, I think it's pretty straightforward. It's been very well documented that climates have warmed. you know, Dyson, I think about this all the time. Richard Summers, when he planted grapes here in the late 50s, early 60s, he did so in a fairly inhospitable climate. And it's altered over time. I think you got to give him some kudos for understanding what could be grown, planting a few different things and finding out what did better. And then over time, we've transitioned into a state that is much more suitable for growing a wider range of varieties today than it ever has been. What does the future hold? I think we're still kind of in a big sweet spot in the Umpqua Valley in general. And I think that as agribusinesses, we all need to make the right decisions based upon what we're growing both today and in the future. And I can tell you that I think the Umpqua has a lot of potential both now and into the future.
Yeah. And Scott, I know I love coming down to Paul O'Brien, to the tasting room there, and tasting through the wines with you as well, because there are just so many varieties and we go on so many different tangents. And then, we get in the car and drive around the valley, and the landscape is just mind-bogglingly diverse, can you give me a sense of what you're looking for, in that landscape for all of the varieties that you work with? I mean, you make great Pinot Noir, great Pinot Blanc, Cabernet Franc. It's you go Rhone, Bordeaux, everywhere.
Yeah, and it really speaks to what drew me to this area. Having made wine in California for my whole career, as well as Italy and Australia, I sort of set out on this path, I guess, as we all do once we spend some time in the industry, to sort of figure out what I want to do for the rest of my career. And I was looking for something very much European in style. When I was in California, we were hydroponically farming grapevines. We had access to water. We had access to the ability to, keep these vines irrigated. And, just by the nature of the climate and what we were dealing with, it was nothing to be pulling Pinot Noir off at, 28, 30 bricks and making super high alcohol wines. And I didn't enjoy it. I didn't enjoy those wines. In fact, I go back in my cellar now and I pull out some of my resume and drink those wines, and I just can't do it anymore. It's funny how you change. But I was drawn up to the Umpqua, and Dyson, and I worked together at Robert Mondavi, and I had some attachments to the area, but he drew me to this area. And what really was the calling was this idea that we could dry farm and we could produce wines true to terroir and true to region. And the Umpqua, with this diversity, I was heading to the Willamette just to make Pinot, but what I saw here was the ability to not only make world-class Pinot Noir, but the ability to really experiment and pioneer and play with a wide range of varieties, some of which have been mentioned here, some have yet to be mentioned. But I love this picture, Bree. This really speaks to topography. And, Valley is, I think we have to be really careful. We are the Umpqua Valley, there's no doubt about it. But most valleys, especially the ones I've worked in, the Salinas Valley, Monterey, Napa Valley, Sonoma, Willamette Valley, those are distinct valleys. We really don't have a part of our appellation that is a valley in that sense. We are the land of 100 valleys. We can't stress that enough. Depending on where you're planted, where you choose to plant, and again, this is a perfect picture that shows those hillside rolling hills, the conifers on the west side that Dyson made mention to, some of the oak tree and oak savanna that rolls out to the east side, but it's like facets on a diamond. So depending on what elevation we're at, depending on if we're north, south, east, west, depending on at the upper end of the appellation, as Dyson mentions, a little bit cooler, southern tends to be a little bit warmer, but there are pockets even within that. Some of the warmest areas in the appellation are to the north, but it just tends to be a pocket that tends to not get the cool marine air. So I tend to work with a lot of the Burgundian varietals. As you mentioned, we also do a bit of Bordeaux. With Cabernet Franc here is just spectacular. But I also tend to work with Rhone varieties. For Pinot Noir, I've been playing a lot with elevation. And what's interesting about the Umpqua, the Pinot Noir here is very different. A lot of times I find that a region with Pinot Noir will have power or it'll have elegance. You usually trade one for the other. And what we have here in the Umpqua is this beautiful tension between the two of power and elegance that you don't see in a lot of regions. And we'll show our Pinot Noirs out to the world as we take them out into the wholesale market, especially. And a lot of people are super interested in the Umpqua Valley because you see this concentration and depth of flavor and fruit, and still have the balance, the acidity, the perfume, the elegance that we get from Oregon Pinot Noir, but done in a much more balanced way. And so I love the Pinot Noirs here, especially. We'll have some of my vineyard sites are 1,200 feet in elevation. They're old cleared commune sites out in the middle of the fir forest, as well as some a little bit lower in elevation, but maybe a little more near the coast, and with quite more age in vine. So we're talking, these are somewhere up around 40 to 50 years of age in vine age. So those are pretty spectacular. Chardonnay, Pinot Blanc, across the board, the aromatic whites, all the whites here have this tension of minerality. And, for instance, the Chardonnays we do at Paul O'Brien, I don't throw a lot of oak or mallow at them. I just really love that sort of almost Chablis style of building in acidity and just letting that ride. And Greg mentioned natural acidity. And I just love the fact that, that those diurnal shifts give me the opportunity as a winemaker to work with fruit that just has natural acidity. I mean, we don't buy much acid, if any, because we just don't need it. And in California, it was like, bring in the palates, because you're always trying to bring the pH down. Rhone varieties, I think, are really, really fascinating. And we're really at the cusp of exploration. There's a couple wineries here that have done a fabulous job with Syrah. I'm also seeing beautiful Viognier, not that overripe cloying style of Viognier, but Viognier with minerality. There's some Grenache Blanc planted, secret. There's, the secret's out, but a couple different sites have Grenache Blanc now. So I think you'll see a little bit more exploration on the Rhone white side. GSM, Grenache Syrah Mourvedre, really beautiful Grenache here. Both, people make them rosé, Grenache rosé on the early season side, and then full blown Grenache is just gorgeous here. Again, there's a tension, there's an acidity there that we typically don't see that makes our Grenache a little bit different. I think than what you'll see in some of the warmer climates or even Southern Rhone style Grenache. It tends to have more balanced acidity. So it's really an animal within itself. But across those varieties, I'm really excited. I can't wait to see where we go from here. And, there's so much to do and so many varieties and so little time that I think we're all, looking forward to the future. And yet at the same time, as you taste around the Umpqua, you see a set of world-class wines already.
Yeah, I was really impressed with a handful of the Syrahs that I was tasting at Texom Wine Awards, and I think one of the wines, awarded as best Oregon red wine was a Syrah from the Umpqua, but it had this amazing balance of ripe brambly fruit, blue and purple fruit profile, but with this element of, peppery, fresh cracked pepper. Do you think that comes from that diurnal shift, or, where are you getting this nice balance of, it was even more, Rhone than a lot of the Rhone is these days.
Well, I'd like to add, I think, Brie, I think it's the diurnal shift during ripening, but it's the difference between the cooler locations to the north and the warmer locations to the south, because we can find that beautiful fruit characteristic throughout the entire region, but the peppery notes come from a little further north, and less peppery notes come from a little further south. So I think we get that. I think we get it with both Tempranillo, a very different style, and even Malbec to some degree. But Syrah and Tempranillo clearly show that.
And I think there's a complexity to the wines here that gets overshadowed by overripeness in some regions. Mm-hmm. When you're making Syrah at 16 alcohol and you get those pruny over the top characters with lots of oak, you tend to kind of miss out on the complexity. And what I love here in both Tempranillos, the Syrahs we make, the Cabernet Franc is another one that, you know, is really, really complex. And you get that beautiful white pepper on the Cabernet Francs here that I think are kind of lost in some of the other regions that tend to make Cabernet Franc.
Yeah, and I think that is something that's special about this region as well, is that you still get the ripeness of fruit with spice character, but it's not a herbaceous character on the border varieties, which is, you know, typically what they're trying to get rid of in, you know, Napa and Washington a lot of the time. And we're able to, get that complexity at that moderate alcohol levels and fresh fruit flavors.
You know, Bree and Scott and Dyson, I'd like to bring up the concept of hang time. I mean, we all know what hang time is. When I first started interacting with Richard Smart years ago, Richard said, if you have to talk about hang time, then you got the wrong variety in the wrong climate. Or maybe it's the vintage that is the challenge. But the idea there is, I think that when we look at the Umpqua, I think that we don't have to consider hang time anywhere near as much as others do, because of that nature of the length of the growing season and how the varieties ripen right at the end and right at the edge. I think that's really critical.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. You know, I'll go back to irrigation, Greg, and what I found is we were actually, you know, fighting off these supercharged vines that were making so much sugar so quick. Yet we didn't have phenological maturity, you didn't have seed maturity, you didn't have flavor maturity. It took me a little bit. Dyson, you know, actually kind of had to remind me, he said, you know, we can ripen Tempranillo here at 22.5. And, you know, it's beautiful, it's gorgeous. And you start thinking about picking at those because that's when the fruit's actually ripe. Whereas when I was in California, I was, you know, you don't even go out in the vineyard at 22.5. No. You know, we start sampling at 23, 24, 25 as we're starting to, you know, see the skin soften, the seeds brown, and those maturity parameters come up, and flavor. That was another big thing.
Yeah.
I'd like to refer back to something a grower and Barolo once told me, that the great seasons for them were the long, cool growing seasons that were dry. And I think that we kind of build into that. And there's a lot to be said. Actually, the first time I ever heard of Umpqua Valley was Richard Summers, once again, that started Hillcrest, father of Oregon wine, was an interview that he gave, and he talked about the importance of, you know, the right climate during the month that really the flavors are developed at the very end. And it's not only a question of developing flavors, but it's also retaining flavors. And so I can remember, you know, I used to walk about 400 acres of Pinot down in Carneros for Mondavi, and you'd get out of the, you know, into the vineyard with the sun hasn't risen yet, and you get out of your car, and first thing in the morning during a warm spell, you can smell that fruit. And if you smell that fruit, that means you're not trapping it in a bottle of wine. And it's much like blackberries. You go into a little creekside in the middle of the summer, those blackberries are ripe. When you smell that perfume, it's great, but you haven't trapped it. And so I think we have really an optimal harvest window that, as Greg said, is dry, but it's pushed back a little bit later, where we develop, because it's not really hot, it's not really cold. We're developing a lot of those flavors, that perfume, but that perfume is really trapped inside the fruit. And then without the power, the high alcohol and heavy winemaking, there in all the wines here, there is a power, natural power, but there's a tenderness, and that tenderness of lower alcohol, brighter acidity really makes for wines that are so easy to drink and much more classic than I think we see in a lot of areas on the West Coast. We're really the perfect hybrid of the ripeness of the new world, but that kind of that precision, that elegance, and that balance of the old world. And I think the comments about the Syrah spoke to that.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, that what you just hit on, that which Greg has been talking about as well, is that end season ripening when that temperature drops, and so you're not really accumulating a lot of sugar. You know, you're not, like to Scott's point, you know, we're not trying to shut down that sugar, you know, ripening, but what we're getting is that very gentle and protracted flavor development, which so many regions can no longer achieve, really. Yeah, it's a pretty special place to, to be able to grow, just so many varieties to such a high quality level.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's exciting me about visiting the Umpqua and seeing the wines out in the national marketplace, is that there's just a obvious high level of quality across so many different varieties, and you don't really have to limit yourself to a single variety. Even though Pinot Noir is the most planted grape variety there for now, we'll see where everything else takes us as well. But I love that there's so many people exploring and planting different varieties, and really seeing what the region is capable of.
It's interesting that they one of the slides had the chart on the right of the varietal breakdown that you're referring to, Brie. It had Pinot Noir being #1 at 60%. That's really, there are pockets that do great wine, but there's also the business of wine, where there are a lot of producers out of the north in particular that come down here and shop for the good stuff at a low price kind of thing. But the real part of that slide to pay attention to is the 5% on the bottom that's the other, and then a couple of the varieties that are mixed in there. Because when you walk into a tasting room here, if you looked at that, you'd expect everybody to make 10 Pinots and a little this, a little that on the side. You walk into the tasting rooms here, and as because you've been down here, you walk in and there's Pinot is oftentimes presented, but there's 10 other varieties you've not tasted or heard of before planted in Oregon. And so that diversity as we explore, but that's really that. If you want the pulse of Umpqua Valley, it's that 5%. What's happening in that, the new varieties, things that are in the ground we don't really know about, but then also what's new in wine. I mean, it's 7,000-year-old industry, so new stuff we started doing 20 and 30 years ago too in the history of fine wine. But it's really so exciting to know you can stick something new in the ground and probably make a very nice wine at least.
Why don't you guys talk about that a little bit? Greg, what sort of things do you guys have going on over at Abacela that's new and exciting?
Well, the most exciting things, I think, beyond kind of what we've become known for, are some of the Portuguese varieties. Tinta Amarela is just absolutely lovely here. I wish we had more of it. Just a variety that has a different expression in terms of its fruit characteristics, and I just think it has a lot of potential. We also do Tinta Cow, which is a little bit of, it's our latest ripening variety, but it adds some real good backbone to our port wine program. And then Pinot is one that I think is kind of really a no-brainer for this region. It's a fairly prolific producer. It produces a wine, if you can manage the tannins, one that has a lifetime of aging potential. So those are things I'm very excited about. I still think we need to plant more Albarino in this region. I think that it's a very easy variety. And I think what you were saying just a minute ago really hit home for me too. In a warm climate, it's hard to plant multiple different cool to warm varieties on the same site.
Yeah.
In a cool climate, it's hard to plant warm to cool varieties in the same site. But within the Umpqua, a little bit of variation in the topography, you can plant a range of varieties and do fairly well. At Abacela, we do everything from Albarino to Tinta Cow and Tempranillo all on the same site. And I think we have the potential here because of that ideal growing season structural climate.
And Dyson, what do you guys have going on? You've got some new stuff in the ground, right?
Yeah, we got some new stuff in the ground. Yeah, I mean, and there's things that I want to plant. Yeah, the perpetual disease. It's a tough place, Umpqua Valley, because you drive around and you're looking at something that would be primo site in Russian River and happens to be like some sheep on it here. Endless. But so what originally brought or made me aware of Umpqua Valley was doing climate research on NOAA's website, where they share a lot of data with other governments. And I was looking at that mean temperature the month of harvest, and because of that interview once again that Richard Summers gave, and the importance on aromatics, or the focus on aromatics, and so it was the two areas of the world I was trying to pinpoint, Piemonte, northern Italy, and the two areas that showed up, number one was Mendoza, Argentina, and number two was Roseburg, Oregon. And I wasn't sure where Roseburg, Oregon was. I'd been to McMinnville many times, but and so there's an exploration of Italian varietals. So Richard Summers planted, amongst other things, Barbera, which is successful, but interesting Terroir cuttings that I got from Scott at La Familia de Robert Mondavi when I first moved up here, and I don't think Scott even had a gleam in his eye about moving to Umpqua Valley at that point. There were two, but Terroir was very successful in that program in two different selections, and I brought one of those selections up that Scott had given me. That's turned into a really amazing, very distinctive wine. I say good wines taste like a grape and great wines taste like a place. There's a fingerprint to Terroir in Umpqua Valley that's very powerful. But the Italian stuff, we've now that we've got our feet really on the ground, we've spent quite a bit of time with. We've got a Sangiovese, the Terroir is mentioned. Fresia is something of fantastic interest. Fresia is, the variety that really built, the way Malbec built the reputation of Bordeaux, Fresia built the reputation of Barolo Barbaresco before Nebbiolo. And so that's something, but I wonder about like Petit and Gros Manseng. Those are varieties that are beautiful varieties. And this is the disease. There are so many varieties out there that are really interesting. To be, something esoteric, as I have a little bit of Kadarka in the ground, which, that's a Eastern European variety that a friend of mine had brought over many years ago from Hungary. But it's, you have to limit yourself somewhat, because the other side of it is you want to make something that would be interesting commercially or for blending, and so we have to leave something for the future.
You've had good luck with Malbec as well, and Cab Franc, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because I really those varieties are spectacular. As a matter of fact, Richard Summers, when he came up, I mentioned that he went to Old Man Louis Martini and got these 35 varieties. I asked him on several occasions after we'd taken over, we knew the Pinot Noir and the Riesling were super successful, but of the other 33, if you had to plant a few of those again, what would they be? And he'd always very slowly tell me Malbec, Malbec, and Malbec. And Malbec, it's interesting because I don't look at it as really an emerging variety. As something that's been grown on this property since '61, and it makes truly stunning wines. Brie selected, as a matter of fact, when we first shut down, and it was a Oregon Wine Board tasting for wine writers. One of the wines that was selected to present was a 2013 Malbec that we did that was aged 5 years, much like classic Barolo Barbaresco. Super stunning, to me, very, very beautiful wines that it's a very different side. It's not the Argentinian kind of very sweet, soft side, and it's not the Cahors side, the French side that's kind of more earthy and kind of angular. There's a juiciness, sweetness of fruit with a beautiful backbone. It's that, Scott was touching on that power and elegance, that tension, and that variety tends to sing. And we see, I think there's more and more interest in that. But I look at there were varieties that have been planted here, that maybe people grew them for a while. Once we got phylloxera, a lot of the alternative varieties kind of faded away, as you saw the big plantings of Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris. And I think that's beginning to kind of shift now. And we're beginning to see more of the really kind of esoteric, interesting, pushing the limits a little bit. And, as well as style, with Syrah and that, I think, the early Syrahs I tasted here were very different than what I taste today. And I think that like Alain Gréau, Gros Hermitage style, when Brie was speaking, that cracked pepper, kind of sweet, but very kind of chunky, dense fruit that's fresh. We do fresh fruit.
Yeah, that's the one thing that always, when I look at my notes from tasting across all the varieties down in the Umpqua, is that there's this brightness and freshness of fruit. And then the tannin profile as well is this elegant, there's no rusticity really, there's a real elegance to that tannin profile as well that comes along with that bright fruit that just really carries the wines and really lifts the wines from the area, which is always really, impresses me and, frustrates me that we don't see more of them in Portland, because I think everyone just snaps them up down in the area or out and around the rest of the nation as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the good and the bad. I mean, once again, you have these little gardens that have to be figured out, and you can't come in and plant, a 1,500 acre section of one variety and ship it all over the country in terms of fruit. But it's the small producer here. I mean, we have many producers. Oregon is a state of small producers to begin with, but we have many people that produce, 800 cases, 1,500 cases, and that's broken into maybe 7, 8, 10 wines. And so, I mean, literally, you don't have the pallet to load to send somewhere. So, I mean, a lot of the old world finds itself, a lot of the peasant regions of Europe find themselves in the same situation, that you just don't do it on scale that makes sense to ship it, 500 miles away and sell it that way. And so that's part of the secret of the Umpqua Valley.
Yeah, it is. It's always such a joy to travel there and discover what's hidden in each tasting room. It's it's a really pretty place and delicious place to travel to. Scott, what are you excited about?
Oh, I think continuing to explore the Rhone varieties has been fun. The GSM, I've got some new plantings of Grenache, brought in some clones of Alban that I'm really excited to see how they do. And really, the whites, I love the aromatic whites and working with, the minerality, as I mentioned before, in Grenache Blanc and Viognier, Albarino. I think there's just so much to be, the Riesling, we just, found we have a new planting of Riesling that's just come back online in 2021. And that's just spectacular. And it just reminds me again and again how great the white wines of the Umpqua are. And Pinot Blanc is one that is just outrageously good. And so it's kind of that alternative, playing around with styles and exploring. You take the number of varieties that Dyson mentioned a couple of times, 6,000 to 8,000 in the world, and then you apply styles across there. And that's the fun thing for me as a winemaker, is to be able to play around with what these great gardens of the Umpqua have to offer, and hopefully make something world-class and spectacular.
Yeah, they certainly are making amazing wines down there. And for everyone that is on the call or on this webinar, please continue to when you come out here, don't just stop in the north or around Portland. There's a whole world to discover as you start to travel south, and it's definitely worth the journey. And yeah, great hospitality, amazing varieties, and just great winemaking with really curious and creative individuals. And so I'm, from my perspective, it's always such a treat to head to the Umpqua and also to be able to talk about these wines as well. It's always difficult to select what wines you're going to taste from the Umpqua, because you want to taste everything, and you can, but not in a 60-minute webinar.
and we're not far, Bree. We're only 2.5 hours from Portland, and it's an easy drive down I-5. I think a lot of people forget how small Oregon is in the west side, especially. So
yeah, it really is it is very accessible. And even driving up from somewhere like San Francisco, or it's not it's not an arduous journey. It's a pretty breathtaking journey to take.
Definitely.
Well, thank you all of you for being here today. I appreciate your time and sharing the stories of the Umpqua and the beautiful vistas, and painting us a picture for everyone here. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people wanting to come and visit. You just made me want to come back, and I was just down there, so I'll be seeing you again soon, I'm sure. Thank you, everyone. David, did you have anything to add about Oregon Wine Month, or?
No, just I want to thank the panel for joining us. What a wealth of knowledge, and certainly the passion was palpable. Thank you, everybody, for being on the call. I dropped in my email address as well as Bree. So if there is anything you need for Oregon Wine Month, we are here. We look forward to seeing everybody next week. And again, great job, Bree.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone. And drink more Oregon wine.
Your palate will thank you.
Yes, indeed.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well.